It's the Awesemo NBA Live Before Lock. NBA Finals, Game 1, Lakers Heat, sponsored by No House Advantage. Adam, we've got Lofty. He's got another men's hockey league game. He's probably getting his ass kicked tonight. So we're breaking down the games together. Before we get started, though, we've got some money to give away here. Guys, we got an Awesemo Plus Platinum Pass, and here's how you could win on it. You have to guess how many points will the Lakers score in Game 1 of the NBA Finals. Follow Awesemo_com on Twitter and Awesemo NBA on Twitter. Like the pin tweet and reply before the game starts. One random winner with the correct answer will be selected. So, Adam, how many points do you think the Lakers score in Game 1? And by the way, we'll both give out a pick. I don't suggest you guys go and write this pick in because a lot of other people might be doing it, and then you're going to be splitting with a bunch of people. A little GPP theory.
Yeah, I'd go like 115.
I'm going to go a little lower. I'm going to say 110. I think Game 1 of the NBA Finals, this could trend to be a little bit lower scoring. We've seen that from a lot of opening series, but not all that important in terms of the breakdown here. $1 million GPP, $1 million to first on DraftKings. Really ridiculously top-heavy payout. It's almost 50% of the prize pool to first. So with that in mind, how would that impact how you're building lineups for that kind of contest?
I'm not, but outside of that,
that is the responsible answer.
Yeah, I mean it's tough because, like, on one hand, with it being a single game slate, you know, if your approach is truly to try and get first place, you're probably going to build some really shitty lineups and just lose a lot of money because, like, you're going to be like rostering guys that having like a 10% chance of seeing the floor. But I think that you should be more willing to take calculated risks, you know, accept that you're probably going to chop, at least with, you know, a couple people. Try and avoid chopping with like 1,000 people, and you can still, you know, get some decent money that way. But yeah, I think you should be taking risks. I wouldn't advise just completely, you know, setting lineups that are probably not going to score like any points, but definitely, you know, don't be afraid to take a shot. And you and I had talked about it before, running, if you're playing a lot of different lineups, running through different scenarios instead of just using medium projections, you know, bumping guys up based on if XYZ happens, what's the result? You know, that's a good way that you can still make lineups that have a relatively high probability of coming to fruition, but that are lower owned than what the field in general will be doing.
So real quick, I want to get to this because Joe has given us a super chat in YouTube. So get this before we start breaking down some of the teams individually. And I do think this is a good starting point anyway. He said, I've been looking at stacks all day. Is it mandatory to try to get at least either James or Davis in your lineup no matter what? How would you answer that?
I wouldn't say mandatory. Like, I'm not going to set a rule that I have to have one of them. I think that naturally I'm going to have one of them in most lineups, just, you know, how it breaks down. I think that as far as captains go, the pricing on this slate is tighter than normal, or tighter than I think we see a lot of the time. So I think it is a lot harder to get to them, particularly LeBron on DraftKings, but to get to either of them as captains. So I'm a little less inclined to force in lineups that have one of the two superstars as captain than I normally would be. But I think naturally I'm going to end up getting at least one of them in most lineups. Like, you do have, you do, especially with the Lakers, you have enough cheap guys that are in the rotation that if you're just kind of mixing and matching and assuming one of them plays well, whether it's the really obvious value in Alex Caruso or if it ends up being Kuzma or KCP, whoever, there's enough options there that you can play a value guy, get the Anthony Davis, and move on. But I think it is pretty tough to get them to captain.
Yeah, I think I agree with you. It's just hard for me to see what is the lineup construction where neither of those guys, where is the winning lineup where neither of them comes in? Because what's even that scenario? The Heat just destroy the Lakers, and then who plays well in that situation? That's what I really struggle to find. I agree with you. I don't think you need one of them in the captain spot. I don't necessarily think you need both of them in the lineup. I'm just not sure what the scenario is where neither of them end up in the first place lineup.
Right. It would be different if the Lakers had like a third piece that was like a mid-range guy, like if Chris Middleton was on the Lakers or something, just because that was the first, you know, good player that, you know, would be a third guy there that came to mind. But someone like that, you know, Jimmy Butler, if he were on the Lakers or something, like, but there's no real, there's not like a Tyler Hero on the Lakers. There's no third guy like Kyle Kuzma, I guess, but he's not getting minutes. So, you know, who's the guy? There is no mid-range guy on the Lakers really that you're going to say, oh, like maybe this guy plays really well and it takes enough production away from LeBron and Davis to where this game's competitive, but this is the guy that you need. That doesn't really exist on the Lakers. Like, assuming the game's competitive and they score a normal amount of points, LeBron or Davis is going to be one of the highest scorers on the slate, basically without question. Whereas Miami has all the mid-range guys. So I think that if you did build a lineup without LeBron or Davis, it's to basically what you said, like you're going to end up with a lot of the Miami guys because you're going to have the money for whatever you want out of Bam, Hero, Dragic, Butler, like all those guys. But you're just going to naturally end up with like 4 or 5 Miami guys and then running it back with like, Kyle Kuzma or Alex Caruso or something.
Yeah, and then I think talking about the third piece, they would need Kyle Kuzma to be the player that the Lakers fans thought he was coming into the season, where they're just like, oh, Kyle Kuzma, he's the third star. It's like, yeah, I mean, he's in commercials and stuff, but
right.
He's, I've been calling him, he's West Coast Kevin Knox, right? I mean, like, what's the difference between them? It's just Kyle Kuzma's more famous.
Yeah, the only difference is one of them dates Instagram models, and I'm not sure if Kevin Knox does or not.
Which, all right, so leg up to Kyle Kuzma, fair game to him in that situation. And then a lineup building question that we got in the Slack chat. How many uniques do you guys run for Showdown? For Showdown, I think you could run one. There's only so many lineup combinations that if you're playing, even if you're just playing 20 lineups, it's fine to just do one where you just have like a couple value plays that's the only difference from one lineup to another. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, when I crunch my lineups, I set it to one for Showdown because it's something Josh mentioned in his office hours in Premium Slack the other day. But like, there's no right answer to uniques and randomness and all of that. It's kind of, you're just trying to think through what you want to accomplish. And if I'm creating, if I'm playing like 150 lineups, so I'm creating, let's say 1,000 lineups to choose from. If I set it on a Showdown slate to 2 uniques, that's basically taking my optimal lineup, and then every lineup from there has to have 2 different players. I'm going to end up getting some really just kind of off the wall, pretty far away from my optimal construction lineups by the time I'm done. So I will say, like, when I'm playing 3 max, once I go through and I break down my lineups, a lot of times I'll kind of try and keep an eye on, make sure I'm at least playing a different captain in all 3 lineups, or, not basically just playing a 1v1 of each other in all 3. But in 150 max or 20 max or whatever, like I'm definitely just crunching with one unique. And then if I notice that I'm a little too concentrated somewhere, I'll kind of adjust after.
Yeah, for a sport like football where there's a ton of games and a ton of options, I'll go to like 2 or 3 uniques depending on the slate. But for a 1-game basketball slate, there's no reason to do something like that. So let's start getting into the actual analysis of the players here, starting with the Heat side of the game. At the top, Jimmy Butler and Bam Adebayo. Butler actually considerably cheaper on DraftKings than Adebayo, and then it's flip-flopped on FanDuel where Adebayo is the cheaper of the two. Looking at the DraftKings pricing between Butler and Adebayo, which do you prefer as a pay-up option?
Kind of surprised I'm getting to. All right, so I guess kind of a tricky question. In my top ranked lineups, like out of the lineups, I crunched a bunch of lineups before the show and then put them into Excel and ranked them based on some metrics and stuff. So my top ranked lineups have Bam over Butler, but if I were to play like 150 lineups, I think I would have more Butler just because he is a little bit cheaper. But when you combine the projection with the ownership, I think that's what's doing it, is that you have Bam right now projected for 30% ownership on DraftKings, Butler at 50%. Butler's salary being a little, being $1,400 less on DraftKings makes it a lot easier to get him into lineups. But I think that it's causing his ownership, the ownership gap between him and Bam, to be a little bit wider than it should. So I would, out of 150 lineups, I would have more Butler than Bam just because it's going to be easier to get him in the lineups. But when I'm breaking it down and looking at like what I'm doing in my top lineups, I'm actually prioritizing Bam because of the lower ownership.
Yeah, it was something Josh and I talked about before. I agree. It's a lot easier to fit Butler into the lineups, particularly on DraftKings. That 1,400 price difference is a big deal. However, I think Adebayo is the stronger captain play. If you just look at the upside of Butler in the playoffs, he's been really consistent, but the ceiling hasn't been there. He hasn't scored over 45 fantasy points since game 1 of the series against the Bucks. He's been pretty consistent at, like 38 to 32 fantasy point range, whereas the bigger games have come from Adebayo. So I perceive Bam as being the higher upside player with more chance of ending up in the optimal lineup as captain. How do you feel about Butler as a captain play? Do you have any confidence in him there, or do you think the ceiling isn't enough?
So I think that, I mostly agree with you. Like, obviously, throughout the playoffs, you've seen Bam have the bigger games. I don't know that I necessarily want to project that going forward, because Butler can certainly just take over any given game. We just haven't seen him, do it. And he is willing to defer, whereas a lot of superstars or star players aren't. But again, the ownership, I think, is just the gap's too big, I think. We have Butler at almost 17% captain ownership on DraftKings. We have Bam at 3.5%. When I consider their projections and their chances of reaching a target score based on their salary, so even factoring in that Bam is more expensive than Butler, I have Bam's implied ownership at captain at 4%. I have Butler's at 8%, but Butler is projected for 17%. Bam's projected for 3%. So I have Bam being the better captain play when you're factoring in ownership compared to chances of success.
All right. So the next guys we go down that I think we kind of have to compare is Goron Dragic and Tyler Hero. Hero was great last series. He had a number of really standout games. I still think of Dragic as the better fantasy option. And maybe this is something that's a little short-sighted on my end, but I tend to look at the big picture when I'm looking at players' productions. And maybe that's not necessarily fair to do with rookies because they improve so much as the season goes on. But I have the baseline for Dragic set at a decent amount higher than Tyler Hero's. And the price isn't all that much different. Actually, Dragic is cheaper on FanDuel. I think Dragic is the better play of the two. Do you feel any differently?
No, I agree with you. To be fair, I think that they're both good plays because Dragic is getting more ownership, and I don't think that he's getting too much ownership. So he's still someone that I'm rostering a lot of, but I'm rostering both of them a lot. Hero's ownership is considerably lower, only about 13%. Utility ownership, 2% captain ownership on DraftKings. So I'm playing them together a lot because I think that it does give you, a really high ceiling. You're getting two of the potential primary scorers from Miami, and then, you can fit Butler or Bam if you want to. I think it also works kind of as leverage against Butler because, going back to the Bam and Butler conversation, if you do believe that Butler is likely to be overowned, one of the easiest ways for him not to put up a score that you need to have is that buckets just come from somewhere else. And there's a really good chance that if Butler's not the one scoring, that it's Dragic and Hero doing a lot of the work. So I like it as a leverage play in that regard. But just, looking at them individually, I do have Dragic ahead of Hero. I expect him to be the highest usage guy here. I think that you're going to see, of course, a lot of defensive attention going to Butler. I think that the Lakers, you kind of talk, in basketball about just coming into a series, and who do you think that their most likely concern is in the game plan? Like, I think they're probably more willing to lose a game because Goran Dragic goes off than because Jimmy Butler goes off. So, from that aspect, I think that the opportunity should be there for Dragic. So I do like both of them, but I do have Dragic ahead of Hero.
Yeah, I will say this also. I don't think on paper this is the greatest series for Dragic or Hero for that matter. I think that Dragic, just with all the size that the Lakers have on the interior and how many good shot blockers they have, I think that Dragic is going to be pretty reliant on knocking down threes to have really big games in this series, which, we've seen him shoot really well in the playoffs, so it's possible. But the reason that I do get on him a little bit, like you said, is just the ownership's really low. And that's something that we didn't necessarily know was going to be the case earlier in the day. But yeah, where he's at, I think he makes sense. Somebody else, the next guy who is priced on the Heat, Duncan Robinson at 6,800. The price tag is absolutely terrible. However, it seems the field is well aware of that because he's projected to be very low owned. He's the lowest owned projected starter in this game by a mile. So this is something that I always struggle with is in these showdown slates, I want to get exposure to some of these guys who have really low ownership. But at the same time, too, I project Duncan Robinson as such a bad per dollar play that I never know quite what to do with these guys, especially when I think that stars and scrubs is optimal for this type of slate. So how do you feel about Duncan Robinson?
Yeah, so the thing with Robinson, and it's one thing that, I know we talk about a lot, like it's important to compare chances of success to ownership so that you're not just looking at projected ownership in a vacuum. A lot of times you see people just look at an ownership projection and say, so-and-so player is 50% owned, I can't play him, he's chalk, whatever. And vice versa, looking at low-owned guys. Like, yeah, Duncan Robinson's not projected for much ownership. We have him at 5%. He's got a 2% captain ownership. But when I take his salary and compare his chances of success to everyone else on the slate at their salary, reaching a target score based on their salary, I still think Robinson's actually being overowned. I have his implied utility ownership at 3%. I have his implied captain ownership at 1%. So there's appeal there just from a raw number standpoint. Like going back to the question you asked to open the show about winning the Millie Maker. When you're playing a massive field tournament like that, there is appeal just in having to compete against, 10,000 lineups instead of 40,000 lineups if a certain player goes off. But in terms of likelihood for success relative to their ownership, I still actually think Robinson at the salary is being overowned.
Yeah, it's always hard for me to say that a guy who starts it and is projected for 4% ownership is overowned. But then, like I said, too, he just projects as such a crappy per dollar play for me.
Right.
And not only that, but he just doesn't make sense in the roster builds for this slate. When you have Anthony Davis, you have LeBron James, and I think there are a decent amount of viable cheap options on this slate. I mean, he's $1,800 more expensive than Dwight Howard. It's just really hard for me to reason Duncan Robinson as a play. Jay Crowder $600 cheaper. I think Crowder is a much stronger play than Duncan Robinson. And Crowder's been more expensive than Robinson in every single showdown slate all playoffs until all of a sudden in the finals. So that's where I find it hard to get to Duncan Robinson. As for
I
Jay
pulled
Crowder,
up the Alex's boom bust tool on the Awesemo site just to see where he was coming in on Robinson, and I know he defines boom percentage as 5 times your salary plus 10 points. He has Robinson with a 0.1% chance of success there, and he's got him with north of a 95% chance of busting at the salary. So not looking too good. The other thing too, you mentioned the kind of just crappy projection for Robinson. It's not even like he's a player where his median projection isn't going to be good, but he has really wide tails in his distribution. Like, he's a 3-point shooter, and with the exception of one of the games last series where he picked up a couple of steals and got out in transition, he doesn't do anything except shoot threes. So it's not like he's someone that's likely to has the opportunity even to Hassan Whiteside double with blocks or something. Like, he just shoots threes, and it's so hard for someone like that to really put up a score at a high ceiling.
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking through his entire game log for the season. I'm just trying to think. So at his price at 6,800, you probably need somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 fantasy points for him to end up in the optimal lineup. That's probably about a fair estimate. He's done that twice the entire season, including the regular season and playoffs. So the odds of him hitting that ceiling are very minuscule. All things considered, everything all the numbers we've looked at, I think even with the low ownership of Duncan Robinson, it just appears that he's not a very good play. We've got Jay Crowder, I mentioned there, $600 cheaper, $6,200 on DraftKings. He's been a guy who's been pretty safe in the playoffs, hasn't necessarily had a huge ceiling. One thing I'm a little concerned about here is that he's lost a little bit of playing time over the last few games. They've kind of gone to Andre Iguodala a little bit more. So what do you expect from Jay Crowder in this series?
Yeah, I think the Iggy minutes are concerning. We saw that happening in the Milwaukee series where Iguodala was getting run over Crowder at the end of games. Then it kind of stopped last series until the end of the series. It started happening again. So, I think it's a lot of it, I think, has to do with how Crowder is playing. I know at the first game in the Boston series where Iguodala got more run, it was just a matter of Crowder wasn't making any shots, and they just kind of took minutes away from him. So I think, he does at least have the opportunity. Like, if he comes out and plays well, he probably stays on the floor, plays in the fourth quarter, which is appealing in tournaments because, obviously if he's playing well, he's getting fantasy points, and then that also can lead to more minutes. Those minutes should be there. So I think the minutes are volatile, but I think it's at least somewhat based on how he plays, which makes me more willing to take a chance on him.
Yeah, and then, we have to talk about Iguodala here because he goes hand in hand with Jay Crowder. I actually think that Iguodala is one of the better plays on this slate, just as a value play. And he's somebody who I almost never roster for DFS, but I actually liked him as a contrarian play for the Heat's last game. He ended up playing well. He had almost no ownership that game. But I think there's a trend here, and that is the Heat brought in Andre Iguodala. I'm sure they were expected it would end up in the finals, but they brought him in for these big games in the playoffs. And even if they didn't necessarily think that, hey, we're going to be the team to come out of the East, there was a spot where I'm sure they figured, hey, we're going to play against Hawks, we're going to play against the Celtics, and we're going to need Andre Iguodala to guard Jason Tatum at times. We're going to need him to guard Giannis Antetokounmpo. And we look at the Lakers roster with LeBron James, obviously, and how Andre Iguodala has this track record of success guarding LeBron. And I kind of think, regardless of how old he is, regardless of how well he actually defends LeBron in this series, I think this is a spot where they're going to go to Iguodala for extended minutes to guard LeBron. I think it's very reasonable to think that he plays upper 20s minutes this game, which he's done in 2 of his last 3. So I think Iguodala is a pretty strong value play. Do you agree with that?
Yes and no. I think he's a good medium projection value play. His salary is a little more expensive than I would like. Like it did come up to 3,400 on DraftKings. But I think that the medium projection, point per dollar on this slate is good. The problem I run into is, for one, we haven't projected for 28% ownership, which is more than all of the other value plays, with the exception of $3,000 Alex Caruso. And the other problem is just that, even if he does get those minutes, and I don't disagree with you that it's fairly likely that he does, his job on the floor does not produce fantasy points. Like, he's still not going to be shooting. He's still not really going to be doing anything that gets fantasy points. And with his ownership coming in where it's at, I think that in tournaments, there's a bigger edge to taking a chance on some other kind of more volatile, in terms of production value plays at lower ownership, hoping that they outscore Iguodala. I haven't built a cash lineup, but I certainly think that he's someone that could be in a cash build because the point per dollar median projection is good and the minutes are likely to be there. It's just that, if a third of or close to a third of the field is going to roster a guy who in 26 minutes can still very easily give you like 9 fantasy points. I think he projects for between 12 and 13. It's just not a score that I'm really scared not to have in my lineup.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable. I'm just really bullish on the Iguodala could play in this matchup, which is why I like him, because I think there's a chance that he might even play him over 30 minutes in this game. I think that for one, he played really well the last couple of games. He shot well ridiculously well last game. I wouldn't expect anything like that. But even if he plays 28 minutes with his normal permanent fantasy production, that puts him around 20 fantasy points. And I think that is enough. Somebody asked a question here. Would I be willing to roster Andre Iguodala and Jay Crowder together? In general, no, because I do think there's a little bit of negative correlation there. But on a one-game slate, I don't think that you have to strictly set a rule in Fantasy Cruncher to not include them. How do you feel about the correlation between Crowder and Iguodala?
Yeah, I agree with you there. It's something Josh talks about a lot, that he'll crunch lineups before he sets rules and kind of see how often he's getting guys together. Because if you're playing 150 lineups, you don't need to have it on a one-game slate. You don't need to have 0 out of 150 have Crowder and Iguodala. I wouldn't want most of them to have them. If I'm playing single entry, I probably wouldn't want them both, because I don't think it's optimal to have that negative correlation. But there's only so many combinations on a one-game slate. So I think that if I'm getting a little bit of overlap there, it's fine out of a bunch of lineups, but it wouldn't be my primary build.
Just because also people are asking about this in the YouTube chat, about Iguodala on FanDuel. Since there isn't necessarily the same need for salary savings and the salary is a little bit flatter, there aren't really cheap guys, I think there's absolutely no reason to play Andre Iguodala on FanDuel where he's at, 7,500 or 7,000. There's no reason to pay that kind of salary for him, especially because if he does have a big game, it's going to be something like last game where he just happens to hit 5 threes or something like that. He's 7,500 on FanDuel. And you don't get those extra half-point bonuses from Iguodala for hitting those 3. So at that price tag, I don't think there's a reason to go after him on FanDuel. So something else here, because you said that you would rather go after some other cheap plays instead of Iguodala that you think are maybe a little more higher variance, maybe have comparable upside but aren't going to have nearly the same ownership. Are there any cheap Heat guys you really feel strongly about?
Strongly, definitely not. I'll roll the dice on a little bit of 2K Kelly Olynyk, just hoping to get lucky, basically. No guarantee he even plays, but $2,000 for him is cheap enough where he's a good enough producer when he's on the floor that if you just kind of get lucky in the rotation and, if I projected the rotation wrong and Kelly Olynyk plays more than I think he's going to, then I can be in a good spot, but certainly not any confidence there. I will say too that I had Iguodala under projected in terms of minutes a little bit. So I think I'll get to more than I was before the show, at least.
All right. Well, hopefully he plays well, because or else I influenced you into a negative EV play, which I would prefer not to do. So on Kelly Olynyk, the other thing, we talked about this last Wednesday on a Heat game. One of the ways that he stands to gain the most minutes is if Bam Adebayo gets into early foul trouble. Matchup against the Lakers, LeBron James, Dwight Howard, we saw him get Jokic into foul trouble a decent amount in the last series. I think that's the situation that we really see Olynyk play, 15, 16 minutes or something like that and have a decent fantasy scores if Bam gets into foul trouble. So something else that I've said on previous shows as it applies to Olynyk, I think that setting a rule to have some exposure to Olynyk, but not having him in the same lineups with Bam Adebayo, that's what makes a lot of sense, because that's where I think the most upside is created for him.
Yeah, completely agree with that. And also, it works out really nicely here because the main value or the main reason that Olynyk would be in your lineup is to get you one of LeBron or Davis a captain. And if you're getting LeBron or Davis a captain, it's really hard to get Bam in your lineup anyway because of how expensive he is on DraftKings. Those builds are a lot more frequently going to be going to the Jay Crowder, Tyler Hero, Goran Dragic range. So you're not going to have Bam really in those lineups anyway. You may as well try and maximize on basically a bad Bam game by saying, okay, may as well play Olynyk.
All right, and now just rounding out the Heat roster. Also, one thing that I would hope we get soon, are the Lakers going to put out a starting lineup anytime soon?
that would be helpful.
The game starts in 30 minutes. I legitimately have no clue. Is JaVale McGee starting? Is Dwight Howard starting? Is Markieff Morris starting? My gut feeling is Howard, but we just don't know yet. So that's why I was saving the Lakers to do second, because I was hoping they were going to have a starting lineup by then, but apparently not. And also, this is going to be kind of important for the Lakers starting lineup. Do you see Myers Leonard getting minutes tonight?
I do not.
Yeah, neither do I. I know Josh had some interest in Myers Leonard earlier. He had a hunch that Myers Leonard was going to be in the rotation ahead of Kelly Olynyk. I think it's a possibility. I wouldn't say there's no chance it happens because it's the first game they're playing. We don't know how the teams are going to adjust. But for me, Olynyk's been ahead of Myers Leonard the entire postseason. Myers Leonard has appeared in one game all postseason. He played 9 minutes and scored 3 fantasy points in the game against the Bucks. Considering how little he's gotten on the court and how poorly he's produced when he's actually came onto the floor, I can't justify putting any kind of investment into him. And this from somebody who touted Robert Williams last week after he had multiple DNPs in a row. I can't go to Myers Leonard. Would you be willing to have any exposure to him? I
wouldn't plan on it. It's the kind of guy where if you're playing the Millie Maker, then it's not like it's not going to make you really more likely to lose money in that tournament than you are anyway. But the difference is like Robert Williams, you would at least seen Brad Stevens have the inclination to play him at times. Myers Leonard just is kind of forgotten. Like Spoelstra has shown no willingness to play him whatsoever.
One quick question we have here that I'll answer before we get on to the Lakers side of the game is somebody said, who scores more fantasy points on FanDuel, Dragic or Hero? For me, it's Dragic, and he's also cheaper on FanDuel than Hero. So to me, I think he makes a lot more sense. Unless you're just looking for an ownership play, then you can go to Hero, but or else I think that Dragic is the much stronger play on FanDuel.
Yeah, completely agree with that.
Before we go any further, got to pay some bills here. Read an ad. Sponsor the show, No House Advantage. Guys, this is a different spin on daily fantasy sports. As opposed to just playing the traditional way with salaries on FanDuel and DraftKings, you construct lineups using player props. This is across NBA, MLB, NFL, and PGA for cash prizes. It's peer-to-peer sports. You play against your friends, and the way you set lineups is there's prop bets. You pick a number 1 through 5 in terms of how much confidence you have in individual props, and then you score points based on if those props hit and how many confidence points you gave to each individual prop. So also a thing that I really like about No House Advantage, that we have projections for this on Awesemo.com, and that's something that doesn't really exist anywhere else. So if you sign up for No House Advantage using the promo code Awesemo, you get $20 in free play, and then you also refer a friend, you get $5 on their first deposit. Be your friends, not the house. Win big with player props today. And then, like I said, we have projections for it on Awesemo.com. So if you join No House Advantage, if you're a member at Awesemo also, then you just have an edge that there really doesn't exist anywhere else in the DFS industry, because nobody else is putting out content yet for No House Advantage. And that is an up-and-coming site that's just a different, unique take on DFS. So let's get to the Lakers side of the game. Do we have any starting lineup yet? I haven't seen one. I'm going to check real quick. Fantastic. All right. So with that in mind, who do you think is going to start for the Lakers?
My guess is Howard. It's not based in anything other than he played well to close out the Denver series and he was starting. It wouldn't be surprising at all if they went. So we just got the Miami lineup. It's what you expected. Still do not have a Lakers lineup, but for now I'm operating under the assumption it's Howard. I assume we'll find out in a few minutes.
All right. So I like, not only do we agree on the same on the starting lineup, but the same logic I used this morning. It was like, hey, Dwight Howard played the last couple of games. He played well. So here's a question that Josh asked me, and I'll ask you the same question. If you were the head coach of the Lakers, so independent of what their lineup is actually going to be, what do you think is their optimal starting lineup for this series?
Probably Dwight.
All right. Yeah, that's what I said too. And it's funny because if you were to ask me this 2 weeks ago, I would have said Anthony Davis at center. And all year I was saying, just play Anthony Davis at center. It's his best position. That's where the Lakers play best. But Dwight didn't start he started a couple of games during the regular season where they had injuries. But for the most part, he didn't start during the year. He played so well next to Anthony Davis. And it was a combination we didn't see much of in the regular season that I'm fine with it going forward. I thought Dwight looked great on defense. He gave Jokic a ton of issues. He got Jokic into foul trouble. Jokic struggled to score on him at times. So I hope that's a starting lineup. And if nothing else, that gives us a whole lot of value. And the other thing also is if we don't get this Howard news until later in the day, like 5 minutes before lock or something like that, that might really suppress his ownership.
Yeah. And I mean, even more so if it's not Howard, like if they go back to McGee or if, they just don't start a center or something. If the lineup, because I assume that most places are projecting Howard to be the starter. So if we get someone other than Howard, their ownership is just going to be really low.
So if Howard comes off the bench, how willing would you be to rock him still?
If Howard comes off the bench, what?
How willing would you be to roster Howard if he's not starting?
Oh, like not at all. His salary's come up enough. He's $5K on DraftKings. You at that salary, I think you need him to start, and you need to hope that he gets at least like mid-20s in minutes. Coming off the bench, like if he comes off the bench, I'm going to assume that we're back to the rotation we were seeing for the majority of the playoffs, where you're getting a stint in each half from McGee and from Howard, and then you're closing with Anthony Davis. So in that case, I would have virtually no interest.
Yeah, and the other one's is if they go back to the Markieff Morris, that's a disaster for Dwight. There was a bunch of games where Dwight played 0 minutes when they started Markieff Morris. I don't think that'll be the case because Howard is so handily outplayed McGee during that. I think that no matter what, he's probably ahead of McGee in the rotation. But yeah, if we have Markieff Morris starting or JaVale McGee starting, I think that really kills the value on Dwight Howard. One other question on Dwight before we move on to the stars here. How many minutes do you have him projected for?
I have him at 24. He, obviously played a ton last game, but typically I think that you'll see him play the first, the second, the third quarter, and then probably not come back.
Yeah, so there's a couple concerns I have with projecting his minutes. First of all, he played 35 minutes last game.
Yeah, he's starting.
There's a massive ceiling. Okay, awesome. Lakers, Dwight Howard, and then the other regulars, LeBron James and Anthony Davis also both started. In case anybody was concerned about that. So yeah, he played 35 minutes last game. The ceiling for his minutes is incredibly high. I was a little hesitant to project him as high as I wanted to in terms of minutes, because if you give him anywhere close to the minutes to your last game, then he's just the best play on the slate by such a wide margin. And then I always think there's a little bit of variance in terms of how the Lakers run the rotation. That and Dwight Howard could get in quick foul trouble, which is always hard to project. But yeah, I think he's if you're rostering a cheap player captain, I think he's viable there.
Yeah. And I think also as far as, I agree that the volatility, the upside in his minutes is there, but also, Bam is a different matchup than Jokic. Like Bam's a very good player, obviously, but he's not the same dominant, like offensive scorer that Jokic is. I don't think that they're necessarily going to put as much attention into matching up with Howard there as they did in the Denver series.
And then, all right, I lied. One more thing on Dwight Howard. We have him projected for 46% ownership in the utility, 7% ownership in the captain spot. I think that's too low of a number. I think his odds of being optimal are considerably higher than that. I think of the players in the mid-range, he by far has the highest ceiling in this game.
I think I agree with that, yeah.
All right, so let's get on to the other question that I'm sure a lot of people are curious about. LeBron James versus Anthony Davis. We got a question in Slack before. Somebody asked me, am I concerned that LeBron has had a lot of off game ones in the playoffs? No, I put absolutely zero weight into that. I think that LeBron James is a very, very good basketball player, and any weak game ones he's had, I don't think there's any trend to that. The other thing to consider also is, he's played against the Warriors, who are arguably the best team in NBA history. He's played them a handful of times. He's had really tough matchups. This matchup is not anywhere near as difficult as that. So yeah, I don't have any concerns about LeBron in game one. More importantly, LeBron versus AD. Who do you think is the better play in this game?
I think it's Davis. They project really similarly for me, but Davis is just less expensive than LeBron. I think that the ownership will be similar. We have utility ownership on DraftKings is about the same, 60% to Davis, 57 to LeBron. There is a difference in captain ownership because it's just so difficult to get to LeBron. But, I think that the name value of LeBron, the whole narrative, whatever narrative you want to go with, whether it's that he's playing Miami or it's just LeBron in the finals, like whatever, people are obviously going to roster him probably at a higher rate than just you would get if you just run projections. So I think that all of those things considered, I lean towards having more Davis. But I'm obviously happy with whatever LeBron I get to.
Yeah, I do think it's interesting. We do right now have Anthony Davis projected for about 2.5 times the captain ownership of LeBron. By far, AD is projected to be the highest owned player in the captain spot. So I do agree that just because there's the big difference in the salary, it's easy to get to Anthony Davis, but LeBron James at only 12% in the captain spot. To your point, yeah, maybe people just end up rostering him more because of the name value on LeBron and people want to play him, but at the same time, too, we've got people in the Slack chat saying to me, like, hey, how come LeBron sucks in game ones? So maybe that'll ring in people's mind also.
And for what it's worth, I have both of them being over-owned in captain still, just when you consider their chances of success at their salary relative to other players. Kind of goes back to what you're talking about at the beginning, where normally I kind of force in star captains, but on this particular with this pricing and with this matchup where you do have so many guys on Miami that are capable of being the highest scorer on that team, I'm leaning more towards going with some, more balanced lineups, for lack of a better way of putting it.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. One thing that we're seeing from the pricing here that's different from any other showdown contest, I can't remember a game where we had LeBron James 13,200, Anthony Davis 12,000. Usually the pricing is a little bit flatter at the top, and that's not the case for this game.
I thought I had an error in my Excel sheet and that I was pulling like their captain salaries.
Yeah, I actually thought something similar earlier where I was looking at it. I was like, oh, what is – I pulled up the DraftKings app this morning right before I did the show with Josh because like, oh, I have the wrong pricing here. There's no way that LeBron is 13,200.
Right.
But he was, and that is definitely different than what we've seen so far in the playoffs. So the next tier of players, let's talk about Rajon Rondo because he's really interesting. I have no clue what his workload is going to be like this game because he went from a guy who was probably the third best player on the Lakers when he first came back from injury. He was playing really well for them, barely played in their last game against the Nuggets. He ended up playing 12 minutes, didn't really produce much. The ceiling's clearly there because we've seen Rondo with a number of big games in the playoffs, but it's still hard for me to know what to do with him when his workload the last 3 games, he went from 30 minutes to 22 to it was 13 last game. So how much do you think Rondo plays in this series?
Yeah, I mean, I think the minutes are obviously really volatile. The salary is not too cheap, but it's not super expensive either when you factor in his upside. I have him in for about 21 minutes here. I think that's a decent median spot. I think that at least to some extent, it depends how he plays. I do also think that it probably benefits him that, as I said before, I think it's less likely that they need to go with big closing lineups here. I think that it shouldn't be very difficult to play some smaller lineups against Miami and get Rondo on the floor more if that's what Frank Vogel wants to do. I don't think matchups should really prevent that. So I'm going with, about 20, 21 minutes as, a medium projection, but a lot of downside and a lot of upside there, I think.
Yeah, I agree. And the other thing that's kind of interesting about Rondo is, contrary to what the public opinion is of him, he's not necessarily a good jump shooter, but he makes them when he's open. He's shot a pretty high percentage from 3. And it was something I was also talking about this morning is people guard him like he's Lou Dort or Ben Simmons or somebody where he gets the ball and they just run away and they let him shoot. Rondo was that bad of a shooter a few years ago. He's not anymore. He could make wide open jump shots now. And so something I find that's pretty interesting is as zone heavy as the Heat have been playing in the playoffs, I could see a situation where Rondo comes in the game and gets a ton of open looks from 3. And I think that's kind of what the Heat are going to do is I think they're going to try to force the ball out of LeBron and AD's hands with their zone, and they're going to try to make wing guys shoot the ball. And I think that it is a situation where Rondo has a chance to succeed. So I think at, 18% ownership overall, that's 16% in the utility, 2% in the captain spot. I think he's a pretty good contrarian play.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. All of it.
So the other guy priced right around Rondo, who I do not like nearly as much, actually a little bit cheaper, Kyle Kuzma, 3,800. Kuzma just stinks so much, but he's a guy who I always have this feeling of maybe there's some upside there just because we've seen him be a good per minute fantasy producer before. It just hasn't existed in the playoffs, and there's literally not an open shot he takes that I ever think is going to go in. It just, he shoots the ball and I assume it's a miss every single time. But 3,800 for Kuzma, the price is cheap. It wouldn't shock me if he had a big game. I just find it really hard to invest in him. Do you have any strong feelings about Kyle Kuzma?
No strong feelings, just that he's cheap. And, to your point, I think he'll get some open looks here. Obviously, the Heat are not going to care if Kyle Kuzma is the one taking shots over LeBron or Davis. It's just, he's very unlikely to do well. He's Kyle Kuzma. He's not very good. And the minutes are unlikely to be really that high either. But he at least can get hot. Like, it's not like you're talking about Iguodala. Like, if Kyle Kuzma plays 20 minutes and shoots the ball 12 times, you're not going to think that, like, the world ended like you would with someone like Iguodala at a similar price point. So from that angle, I think that there is at least some appeal, but it's still not something you're going to feel very good about because he's likely to play 20 minutes. He's likely to not produce, and he's likely to kind of kill your lineup.
So you compared him to Iguodala. They're priced about the same. Kuzma's $400 more expensive. The ownership is nearly the same, which really shocks me. 32% projected ownership for Iguodala, 28% for Kuzma overall. Considering all that information, who do you think is the better play between the two? Because I'm sure a lot of people will be comparing them.
I think it's really close. So once I updated Iguodala's minutes and increased them a little bit, I have it a lot closer. Before I did have Kuzma. Now I think it's Iguodala, not by a lot, but I have them both with about a 10% chance of hitting their target.
All right, there we go. Put it on the Hall of Fame plaque for Andre Iguodala. He is a Finals MVP and once a better DFS play than Kyle Kuzma. The two biggest accomplishments of his career. Getting down to some of these wing options here, KCP, Danny Green, they're whatever to me. I don't really find these guys interesting from the Lakers. I think these are guys with very minimal ceilings and somewhat of a floor. The issue is that these guys are so reliant on hitting shots that and that's really all they do is hit shots, is that if their shot isn't falling, they're probably not going to have a big fantasy game. If they do hit their shots, then maybe they have an okay fantasy game. I think that KCP is a little bit of a stronger play than Danny Green, especially because he's coming in at a decent amount lower ownership. Between Danny Green and KCP, which of these guys do you prefer?
Slight edge to KCP. I have them projected about the same, but like you said, ownership a little bit lower on KCP. I think that the minutes are likely to be higher for KCP as well. So basically they're the same play. It's just that one of them's a little bit lower owned, a little bit more expensive, but the $400 on DraftKings between KCP and Green isn't likely to be a huge problem in building your lineup. So if it is, I have no issue just playing Danny Green instead. But I think that in a perfect world, I would get more KCP just because he's a little bit lower owned.
All right. I don't know if this is a joke or not, but somebody keeps asking a question about Dion Waiters in the YouTube chat. So I guess we might as well talk about Dion Waiters. I haven't projected to play 0 minutes today. I would be pretty surprised if he saw the floor. Something interesting about Dion Waiters, because of the way the NBA rules work with giving out rings, and he was traded from the Heat mid-season, he gets a championship ring no matter who wins today. If the Heat win,
potential playoff share too, right?
No matter what happens, Dion Waiters comes out a winner. And it would be really funny if he plays 0 minutes in the series and he's a champion no matter what. Do you have any expectation for him seeing the court today?
Nope. Same answer as Myers Leonard, really.
Yeah. So then some of these other guys on the Lakers, we haven't talked about Alex Caruso yet. He's projected to be really popular today. It's kind of interesting because, number one, people don't know this. We're contractually obligated to talk about Alex Caruso every single show at Awesemo. It's in our contracts. There's nothing we can do. We have to talk about him. He's also going to be one of the more popular value plays on the slate. Alex Caruso coming in at 50% ownership, nearly in the utility spot. It makes sense. He's a little bit too cheap given what his production and his playing time has been like recently. I'm not totally sold on the minutes, though. I think the ownership is probably a little bit too high. Do you agree with that?
So the thing is, I think Caruso is basically like the only player that is just like clearly underpriced. I don't think we've said anybody is too cheap this entire show. And so that makes him really valuable because, even if he gets like 20 minutes, which I think is towards the low end of his range of outcomes, he still should be able to, give you 13, 14, 15 points at 3K. And then obviously if he's playing well, he can get into the mid 20s in minutes. So just from a roster construction standpoint, I think he's really useful since there's not a ton else that seems underpriced.
I'll say the other player that I think Dwight Howard's pretty clearly underpriced. That's the one other player, although it's a different price range also. I think amongst guys who are, like dirt cheap, Alex Caruso is the one guy who really stands out as a value play. But Dwight Howard too. I guess just the question is how much Caruso would you feel comfortable with?
Yeah, so I mean, we have him at 50% now. I really wouldn't mind going over that just because of what I think he opens up elsewhere in the lineup. I have his implied flex ownership on DraftKings at like 80%. Not saying that I would have 80%, but just saying that I think when you compare his chances of reaching his target score at 3K to other players on the slate at their salaries, he should be the highest owned player.
Yeah, for me, I think it should be Dwight Howard, but I also think there's a case for Caruso, particularly just because of the way the slate shakes out, to where, assuming you want to get LeBron and or AD into lineups, you have to save salary somewhere. Dwight does make a lot of sense to me also, but I think Caruso is my second favorite value play overall. So something else to mention here, guys, we have a new NBA weekly pass when you use the promo code Orlando at checkout. It's only $5, $10 off the original price. This gives you access to Awesemo's leading NBA player projections, ownership projections, and more for every single showdown and single game slate for the rest of the NBA Finals. This offer is valid through Sunday, October 4th. So go sign up. And if you're going to sign up, you might as well do it now because why wait? Get it now before NBA Finals games have already happened. So that is a good deal. So let's talk about some of the – actually, we have a question here that I didn't see in the Slack chat. And I think this is an interesting talking point. Do we put any weight into how these teams played against each other earlier in the season as far as minutes go? Yes and no. I think it's a little bit telling. However, here's the issue. Dwight Howard didn't start at all really during the regular season, and now we have a totally different starting lineup for the Lakers. So I'm not going to really put any weight into the regular season minutes as far as that, because the other thing also is that Myers Leonard started a bunch of games for the Heat in the regular season. So there's no way we could look at that and be like, oh, well, Myers Leonard plays 18 minutes today because that's what he played against the Lakers. It's a different situation. So where I do put weight into how these teams played against each other earlier in the season is once we get into game 3 of the series and we have a couple of games where these teams have played against each other, then we see how they match up a little bit more. And we could say, hey, based on the first 2 games of the series, this is how they're playing against each other. But a game that took place like 8 months ago now, it's hard to really put too much stock into because the starting lineups are totally different.
Yeah, I think that's like a good way of putting it. Like you can use, I think those prior games and like in a situation like this where so much time has passed, teams are different, just different, personnel playing right now. I think those games are going to be most useful kind of as priors when you have some data from this series. Like if, I don't have those games in front of me. I don't know what happened, but let's say Myers Leonard played like more minutes than normal against the Lakers earlier this year. And then in games 1 and 2, Spoelstra dusts off Myers Leonard and gives him minutes. You're going to be more confident saying, okay, Myers Leonard is in the rotation because he did this earlier in the year. He's doing it now. But I'm not going to look at those games and say, this happened then. I think it's going to happen now because, like you said, Miami's had so many different combinations of lineups this year. And the Lakers have also switched things up. So I don't want to draw conclusions from those games, but I will use those games later on in the series kind of as priors to try and figure out if I think if something weird happens in the first game or two, if I think it's likely to continue.
All right. So if anybody has questions, hit those in. We just got 10 minutes until lock. So if you've got anything you want us to answer before we get there, hit me up in Slack, put it in the YouTube chat. I'm paying attention to as much of it as I can. So somebody asked a question here, which I think is reasonable to go back on. Somebody asked, who is the better value play? Because he found it a little confusing, Andre Iguodala or Alex Caruso. To me, I think that overall Caruso is the better value play. But the best value play from the Heat is Andre Iguodala. Based on what you said before, I assume that you also think that Alex Caruso is the top value play.
Yep, agreed. I will say that, so I'm putting together the lineups I'm playing in 3 max right now, and 2 of them have neither of those guys and are going a little bit more balanced. One has Caruso actually at the captain, which I don't really like, but We'll see. I might get rid of that one.
So overall captain plays here. I know you said that you don't necessarily love Anthony Davis or LeBron James as captain relative to their ownership, meaning that you think that they're going to be over-owned in those spots relative to how you project them. So with that in mind, who do you think is the ideal captain play on this slate? If you were playing one single entry lineup, who's the guy who'd go with the captain?
Bam's the captain in my top ranked lineup.
Okay. And then obviously the situation on FanDuel is a little different because there's not the 1.5 X price. We just get the 1.5 X multiplier. With that in mind, who do you think would be the top MVP play on FanDuel?
Let me pull up FanDuel.
I'll say for me, one thing that's interesting here is we have Anthony Davis and LeBron are both projected for very high ownership. They're going to eat up almost all of it. And if you look at how the FanDuel, like any single game slate pays out, it's 33% of the prize pool is the first. So the easiest way to differentiate yourself is by not playing Anthony Davis or LeBron James in the MVP spot. You've got Anthony Davis projected for 50% ownership, LeBron 40% ownership in the MVP. Then we've got Bam taking up almost the rest of it. It's hard for me to really see anybody else being the high scorer in this game, but I think that making lineups with Bam as MVP is the most reasonable way to really make a contrarian lineup on FanDuel.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say too, is that he's beyond Davis and LeBron, I think he's the best combination of salary and upside. Like Butler, you obviously could argue he's got a good chance of being the top scorer as well, but he is more expensive. So I think that with all the ownership going to Davis and LeBron, Bam would be a really good choice there.
So a lot of people bringing up Kyle Kuzma now, so we could hit on him. Also, something else with Kuzma. What do you think is the situation where Kyle Kuzma succeeds in? Like, what is the game script necessary for Kuzma to have that game where he finally scores 25 fantasy points and doesn't totally suck?
He gets hot. He starts shooting the lights out and stays on the floor. Because it's not that hard for him to take minutes from guys ahead of him. He just has to actually play better, I think. I don't think it's not like there's irreplaceable guys ahead of him where if Kyle Kuzma is shooting the lights out, Frank Vogel's still just going to be itching to get him off the floor. It's just that he so rarely shoots the lights out.
Yeah, somebody you're saying, if you play Kuzma, you're going to lose. Yeah, probably.
Probably going to lose no matter who I play.
Yeah,
so.
Yeah, that's true.
That's kind of how
you're playing in the Millie Maker, 50% of the money is going to first place.
Yeah, but when 20% of people in a contest cash, there's a good chance you're going to lose.
So, yeah, I mean, Kyle Kuzma, the odds of him hitting are really low, but he's also projected for not that much ownership. Somebody asked a FanDuel-specific question here, and that is, who is a better play between Tyler Hero and Rajon Rondo? To me, I actually think it's Rondo on FanDuel because Rondo is one of the players who is projected for almost no ownership. Rondo is projected for 6% ownership on FanDuel, and I think the upside is pretty significant for him. I mean, if we're just going points per dollar and who's just the raw better play, then it's Tyler Hero. But when we're taking ownership into account, Rondo is one of the only players that I see that's projected for almost no ownership that has legitimate upside. Like, I don't think there's any real upside in guys like Danny Green or Derek Jones Jr., but Rondo's projected in that same neighborhood in terms of ownership, and he is an actual ceiling.
Yeah, I agree with that. The ownership point being the key one, because like Hero does just obviously project better, but Rondo is one of the guys that, I think if he plays well, he gets more minutes and he is capable of producing at a high rate. It's not like he's just out there playing empty minutes. If he's playing well and gets more minutes, it's pretty easy to see how he has a big game.
Yeah, a few people are asking Caruso and Iggy, good combo. Yeah, you could play them together. There's no real negative correlation there. I think that's perfectly fine. You go to them and then that gives you the space to pay up for guys like AD and LeBron James. Here's something else I kind of think that's an interesting point. If Dwight Howard gets into foul trouble, fairly likely scenario, who do you think benefits from that?
Keith.
Let's see. Yeah, we didn't really talk about Markieff Morris at all. He did start some games for the Lakers. The concern I have was when he came off the bench, he didn't really produce much. He didn't play very many minutes. So just because we didn't talk about him, how do you feel about Markieff Morris as a play in this game?
I mean, not great. You know, I don't expect a ton of playing time from him. Have him at, what did I do? 15 minutes. It's more, you know, I think if Howard does get in foul trouble, that Keith could get some more minutes. If Keith plays well, maybe he, you know, plays a little bit longer rotation and Dwight doesn't come back at in the second quarter or something. But it's certainly not a high probability play.
So I'll say this about Keith, and then I'll get your take on it. I think that, I mean, I talked about Kelly Olynyk and Bam Adebayo being negatively correlated. I would set up a similar rule in Fantasy Cruncher where don't put Dwight Howard and Markieff Morris in the same lineups, because I think the situation where Morris plays big minutes most likely is that Dwight Howard gets in early foul trouble.
Yeah, agreed. So I went ahead and scrapped that Caruso captain lineup on DraftKings. So I actually don't have any of the really cheap value on DraftKings. The cheapest guys I played were out of the three lineups. I have a Kuzma lineup. I have two Danny Green. I wasn't able to get to KCP. And I have Rondo in all three, which scares the hell out of me, but whatever.
I like Rondo as a GPP play. I think he's a really strong tournament play. But I'm sure the hesitancy with you is the same thing I feel, is just I have zero feel for what his minutes are going to be. He played 13 minutes last game. He played anywhere from 10 to 30 minutes, and I'm not surprised today.
Right. Yeah. Howard ended up being my captain in one of them. He's not in the other two, which also doesn't seem great to me. Might change that. But Rondo being in all three, it's kind of just one of those, it's really easy to see how it goes poorly, but I also think it's the reward is worth the risk.
Yeah, people are asking about some value captains. To me, it's Dwight Howard. If you're going to roster a cheap guy in the captain spot, I think Dwight Howard's the one that offers the most upside. Maybe Rondo if you want to be really contrarian, because I do think there is some chance for upside there. But Dwight Howard at 5,000, I mean, we've seen some really big games from him. I mean, just 2 games against the Nuggets, started 12 points, 11 rebounds. I think he had almost a double-double at halftime in that game. And then they just didn't really need him to play a whole ton in the second half. But I think the upside for Howard is pretty substantial. So yeah, he's the guy that I would definitely look as a value play and captain. I don't know that I would get to any of those other guys we like Caruso, Iguodala, Kuzma. Not really guys that I'd be looking for in the captain spot.
I got Rondo down to 2 of 3 lineups now. I got Howard into another one. I feel better about that.
Always good to not be 100% invested in Rajon Rondo.
Yeah.
All right, guys. Any final questions here? Get them in because we've got about 90 seconds. Crowder or Iguodala on FanDuel? For me, I prefer Crowder. The price tags aren't all that different for them on FanDuel. I think that Crowder makes more sense. Iguodala, to me, makes more sense points per dollar on DraftKings. Do you agree with that?
Yep.
And all right. How much LeBron is too much LeBron? I don't really think you can have too much LeBron. I think that he's a perfectly fine player to take a stand on.
Yeah, it's a weird question because any amount of LeBron that I have, I'm going to be happy. I'm never going to look and say, oh, I need less LeBron. That being said, out of the 3 lineups I'm playing, I have Davis in all 3 because it works better with the salaries. And like I said, I just don't have that Caruso Iguodala tier. So, but that's just how my 3 lineups turned out. I'm not saying that you shouldn't play LeBron. And like I said, there's no amount of LeBron that I would look at and say that's too much.
All right. I've got a couple Dragic or Butler questions. Which one makes for the better captain play? Let me bring up what the ownership
Hopefully
is
Dragic.
real quick. Yeah.
I mean, I have Dragic at captain. I don't have Butler. Just looking at my implied ownership numbers, we have 3% ownership going to Dragic. I think he should be 5% owned. We have 17% going to Butler. I think he should be 8% owned. So I think Butler, in terms of just who should be owned at captain more often, is the answer. But when you compare them to projected ownership, I think Dragic is the better leverage.
Yeah, I agree also. The issue with Butler is that's a ridiculously high ownership number for a guy whose usage just hasn't really been there in the playoffs. To a point you made way earlier in the show is that could change at any time. Just because he hasn't had high usage for the last couple of weeks doesn't mean that he will not have high usage of this game. It's just tough for me to project it when he's been so willing to defer in the playoffs. I think there's a much better chance of getting a floor game than a ceiling game from Butler. He's just been so consistent without much upside in the playoffs, which has its utility. It's just not super useful in the captain spot. Yeah,
I mean, the biggest thing is just you like jumping on those spots where something can change going forward that hasn't been the case recently, but you like jumping on them when the field isn't. when the field is just saying, oh yeah, Jimmy Butler's cheap, throw him in at captain. There's not a huge edge in hoping things change because everyone already is.
All right, that's going to wrap the show. We're at lock, guys. Before you head out, do us a favor, hit that thumbs up button. Pretty good ratio. We've got a thumbs up to thumbs down. That's pretty excited about that. We had over 1,000 viewers. That's also pretty exciting. So guys, thanks for listening. And also, if I don't win $1 million, I hope one of you guys do, but I'm certainly rooting for myself over you guys. But don't take it personal. That will wrap up the show. Jordan, play the music.